Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for Shadowproof, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly. It's August 5th. And before we get rolling on our whistleblower stories, which we have for this week, Brian has a few things for you.
Hello, Kevin, and thanks for everybody joining us for our special birthday week edition of The Dissenter. Today, I'm really excited for the stories Kevin has lined up. Before we dive in, I just wanted to remind folks, if you're new here, if you're not following yet, wherever you're watching, please take a moment to do so that you can get alerts on our upcoming shows, so you can keep track of the journalism that we produce at Shadowproof. And if you really like it and you want to make sure that we continue to be here to do this work, that we can keep paying writers and so on and so forth, you can head on over to shadowproof.com/donate. We have donation options there. We also have the dissenter.org, which is Kevin's newsletter that we will talk about at the end of the show. With that being said, let's jump right into our stories for this week. First up, corporate capture of the EPA, hair on fire cases overrule scientists' chemical risk assessments. What's this first story you got here, Kevin?
Yes, so this is a follow-up to a story that we highlighted back in July. Actually, we have a couple of these this week. And this one from Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, or PEER. It comes from them. They submitted new information to a congressional committee showing how a system of chemical risk assessments mandated by a statute for the past 5 years is completely captured by the industry, which the system is supposed to oversee and regulate. You have key managers, they say, who move back and forth between jobs at the EPA and chemical industry. There's scant revolving door or conflict of interest scrutiny. Besides ignoring risk indicators for these assessments, EPA managers allegedly routinely use a 90-day review timeline to intimidate staff into signing off on assessments where there is insufficient data to reach a conclusion. That's their quote from their press release. So there's a series that has been ongoing at the Intercept featuring whistleblowers from the division that handles these chemical risk assessments. And they have testified or shared their own experiences facing intimidation and harassment that is coming from the pressure that the chemical industry has applied to the EPA. And we learn about something called hair on fire cases in the latest report from the series. Sharon Lerner is doing some fine work giving these whistleblowers a platform. And we meet William Irwin, who is a scientist that was assessing safety of chemicals at the Environmental Protection Agency. They wanted him to sign off on a report that would give a chemical, the agency, wanted a chemical to be given an okay to enter the market. And he refused to affix and provide his signature to this. The problem he found was that this actually was not a safe chemical. He's a doctor. He understands the risks of green lighting chemicals. And as he was looking at them, he found that it could have an impact on developing fetuses. And as Sharon Lerner describes, because the manufacturer had not submitted any health studies, he had found an analog, a structurally similar chemical to help predict its effects. And then he looked at this compound, and it was bisphenol A, or BPA, an additive to plastics that is well known to cause reproductive problems as well as immune and neurological effects. Then Irwin noticed his concerns and a lack of studies that could allay them, and he worked on the assessment. And ultimately, it documented these risks that workers could expose from breathing and touching these chemicals. And so he did not want this to be approved. But the chemical fell into a category at this division of the EPA that's called hair on fire, which are high priority situations in which manufacturers object to scientists' findings that their chemicals pose hazards, according to Irwin and the report from Sharon Lerner. So after he refused to sign off on these findings, what happened to him? A higher ranked employee was brought in to take over the case. They took a different approach to the chemical and avoided calculating some of the developmental risks that would be posed if the chemical was out being manufactured or allowed into manufacturing. And then on June 15th, 2020, the final risk assessment for this chemical, which minimized risks to was put out, and it downplayed risks to the general population. It did not calculate the risks posed to workers if this chemical was permitted by the EPA. So in that case, this is one glaring example of how this division is not functioning independently. And most importantly, there's a law that was passed 5 years ago that laid out the process by which there was supposed to be some regulation of the chemical industry. And as is clear, they've found a way to make it work for them. So it looks like they're going through a process, but in fact, they're in charge of the regulating. They regulate themselves, basically.
Thank you, Kevin. Why don't you walk us through our next story here? More revelations exposing contractors hired to care for migrant children at Fort Bliss.
Yeah. So this goes back to a story we highlighted in July. And there's been some pretty good mainstream coverage of this by whistleblowers who have come forward. There were several stories written about how COVID infections were ongoing among migrant children at Fort Bliss, and they were hiding the fact that there were staff getting infections from children, and also that they weren't taking the proper precautions to prevent the spread of COVID-19 at this facility. And so now, I'd like to focus on this week on the gross mismanagement by these contractors who are working for Health and Human Services at Fort Bliss. And we talked about one company back in July because two whistleblowers brought this company to our attention, ServPro, SERV Pro. And they were hired to provide childcare for undocumented immigrant children. But the problem is ServPro does not provide childcare as part of their business. They are a fire and water damage repair company. And now we have two additional whistleblowers who have come forward, and the Government Accountability Project is working with them as well to help them get attention to the fact that two additional contractors were hired for this care of migrant children, for overseeing what goes on at this base. But they also have no background in childcare and probably should not have been given the contracts. Chenega Corporation is an Alaska Native Village corporation, which, quote, figures prominently in a diverse government services contracting marketplace supporting defense, intelligence, and federal civilian customers, or so they say. And they do environmental healthcare, military intelligence and operations support, and professional services and security. But noticeably, they do not do childcare. They were given, anyways, regardless of the lack of experience, they were given the role of administering a clinical mental health program for children at Fort Bliss. Says, quote, in one of the documents posted by Government Accountability Project, they state that contractor employees told detailees that to get their jobs, so people who would work for the contractor, they were told that they didn't need to do anything more than submit a basic employment application. There was no follow-up or vetting process, no interviews or even phone calls prior to being offered their job and asked when they could start. And background checks, and another part of this, they say background checks were not completed before personnel began to work with the children. Then we learned that Rapid Deployment Incorporated is the other company that has no child care experience. They specialize in, quote, base camp deployment and support. And they were granted 2 really sizable contracts that total $614 million to manage Fort Bliss. Now, ServPro had a very interesting reaction to these revelations that were going around about them having no childcare experience. They claimed that, quote, when we became aware of this issue of no childcare experience, we immediately advised the franchise operator that these are not approved ServPro service offerings. And then they add, we have been informed by the franchise operator that it is no longer providing these services through the ServPro franchise. But the interesting thing about that is if it's not happening under ServPro's umbrella, the people who were hired under the ServPro contract are still the people there at Fort Bliss doing this work, even though all of them were brought on board in a manner in which, like, these aren't the people you would want near children and being asked to take care of hundreds, if not thousands of children on any given day. And so I don't think that really alleviates much concern. Wiping their hands clean of some franchise, I think it probably just raises many more questions for the whistleblowers and others who are seeking accountability here at Fort Bliss.
Oh, sorry, Kevin. My fingers are moving a little bit slowly today. Let's go on to our next story here. We have Governor Cuomo retaliated against a whistleblower who alleged sexual harassment. Why don't you update us on this part of this story that's been unfolding the last few weeks, last few days?
Yeah. This is getting a lot of attention, but I thought it was important to bring in here because, for a lot of Andrew Cuomo's career, he's been untouchable. He's been lauded by the mass media. He's been held up as this kind of liberal paragon as a governor of New York. And it was, I think, discussed that he may have had aspirations for running for president at some point. And yeah, he's been involved in several examples of corruption in the last years. The nursing home deaths, those were unconscionable. What happened to people's families in New York nursing homes during the pandemic. But then we also have this, where we learn about what it's like to work for Andrew Cuomo in the New York State government, and that he has basically created a culture of fear and intimidation in his office. And the New York Attorney General's office looked at sexual harassment allegations against Andrew Cuomo and documented almost every allegation, nearly every allegation, it seems, that came from over 10 women who had alleged sexual harassment against Andrew Cuomo. And so the governor is now under tremendous pressure to resign. I think he's lost support from a lot of people locally in New York. He also seems to have lost the support from the White House, and he's losing support from people who are senators and representatives in Congress. This report clearly documents the extent to which his office, not only sought to discredit people who came forward with sexual harassment claims, but also was a place where you couldn't speak ill of Andrew Cuomo. I think it's an important whistleblower story to tell, to dig in and piece together what we learned from the Attorney General's office report, because what you see is why Andrew Cuomo is able to get away with a lot over the last few years. When it comes to the nursing homes, he was able to abuse taxpayer resources to promote his pandemic book. And the reason why he can get away with that is because he spreads this fear to people among his staff that they will not cross him and say anything of him. And the people who are in his circle closely tied to him are committed to protecting the governor, as this attorney general report documents. Letitia James is the attorney general in New York. And she said, "This is a sad day for New York because independent investigators have concluded that Governor Cuomo sexually harassed multiple women and in doing so broke the law. I'm grateful to all the women who came forward to tell their stories in painstaking detail, enabling investigators to get to the truth. No man, no matter how powerful, can be allowed to harass women or violate our human rights laws." And so, not only was he violating laws against sexual harassment, but he's violating laws against whistleblower retaliation or retaliation against employees in the workplace who have concerns about how they are being treated. And another thing that I learned, and I want to say I first learned from relatively conservative or right-wing media, and I didn't think it was true, but I had to go check it, and it's actually in the Attorney General's report. And they're just happy. The right is just happy to own Andrew Cuomo in this manner. But it is really stunning. So a lot of the report, as I documented at the Dissenter, I did a piece about this. A lot of it starts with Lindsey Boylan, who's like the first person to allege publicly against Andrew Cuomo that she was sexually harassed and this happened back in December of 2020. And then immediately, as the report shows, the people around Cuomo didn't decide to figure out if Lindsey Boylan was telling the truth. They wanted to discredit her, and they talked about how they could draft So the governor worked on an op-ed, worked on a letter, something that could maybe go out to the media for publication in response to what Lindsey Boylan was saying about Andrew Cuomo. And this was shared with people, and there were actually this op-ed that would have been used to attack Lindsey Boylan was considered, not so good of an idea. Maybe we shouldn't do this by some, or then there were a few that said, well, you have to make a lot of changes if you want to go forward with it. But incredibly, two people, Time's Up co-founders Roberta Kaplan and Tina Chen, were involved in looking at the draft of this letter, were asked to give Cuomo cover, and Kaplan was one of the few who thought, quote, the letter was okay with some changes, even though everyone else thought it was a bad idea. And that's in the Attorney General's office report, that they were involved. These people are from the Me Too movement. Their organization gained credibility, standing up for women then, and yet they're involved here. The Attorney General's office was able to find that they were helping to give political cover, or interested and willing to give political cover to Cuomo to go after a woman who was blowing the whistle on sexual harassment in Andrew Cuomo's office. It's rather stunning to think. And they say, one staffer, I'll end with this, one staff member said that they told investigators the executive chamber was a, quote, mix between the West Wing and the Devil Wears Prada, noting that the governor's senior staff consists of big personalities who are comfortable using power and who maintain a culture of fear and intimidation. And, I think what we see here is the way that if you have a workplace where sexual harassment is normalized, you are also creating a kind of toxic workplace where it will be nearly impossible for whistleblowers to feel like they can come forward, because, in seeing how this was rampant and that they couldn't do anything about it, it also helped create the kind of climate that protected the governor. In other words, it kind of feeds off each other. Having a culture of fear and intimidation against people coming forward means that there's people who can get away with the suggestive comments and the kind of misogyny that is documented in this report. it corroborates all of these things that Cuomo wanted all of us to believe were not true. And now we have this report that shows not only that he's involved in sexual harassment, but he basically ran an office that discouraged any whistleblowers from coming forward. So what corruption haven't we learned because of the toxic workplace that Cuomo has managed for the time that he's been governor? You know, I mean, we think we have to run down the list in our heads with our imagination and ask, you know, how much more are we going to learn about the reign of Cuomo over New York after I think he's going to be run out of the New York office eventually. And I think there's going to be people who come and talk about what they were asked to do for him. And there are going to be other stories, other scandalous stories that have been suppressed up to this point because Cuomo was such a powerful individual.
Definitely some important points there, Kevin. Thank you. Let's turn next to Daniel Hale, who spent his birthday in jail in a room with over 100 prisoners. Why don't you fill us in with the details here?
There's only a few details to share, but nonetheless, they are important details to get out. The support team for Daniel Hale, drone whistleblower Daniel Hale, case we have covered extensively on the Dissenter Weekly, they reported on July 31st, Daniel Hale's birthday, that Daniel was transferred from the Alexandria Detention Center to the Northern Neck Regional Jail in Warsaw, Virginia. He was put in a room with over 100 people. He had no mattress or blanket. He did not know how long he could be there. He is on his way to Raleigh, North Carolina, where he will be held in one of the facilities in the so-called correctional complex that is in that city. The way this treatment has unfolded is very similar to what happened with Reality Winner, just to say that this isn't as extraordinary, and this is typical of what happens to people as they're being moved and placed in Bureau of Prisons. If I'm wrong, Brian, at any moment you can correct me, but Grady County Jail was where Reality Winner was sent. There were dozens upon dozens of women who she shared space with as she waited to be moved to the facility in Texas, Carswell, FMC Carswell, the women's medical center that she was sent to, the women's medical prison that she was sent to. And and this can last for days. You know, they have to wait until they get a bed for him in this place he's going to go. And at this moment, I do not know exactly where he is going. There's a low security, there's a medium security, there's also a medical center. And I have plenty reason to believe that he may have been placed in a medical center due to the fact that his mental health, well, his health in general, played such a role in this case. And the judge was very familiar with it. And I think he might go to this prison where a lot of people go who have physical and as well as mental health ailments. Again, it's not a good place for healthcare. As a very clear disclaimer, we'd like to say that no prison is a place for healthcare, but nonetheless, you find that there are these federal cases where people are sent to facilities that supposedly are marginally better than if you would go to somewhere that they didn't have a commitment, a supposed commitment to caring for people who have health complications.
Thank you, Kevin. Last but not least, we're turning to Julian Assange. The U.S. appeal in Assange's case is set for August 11th. What is the update here?
Yeah, so just to say, as we wind down the show, and thanks to those of you who catch this archived and live, we really appreciate your support. But next week, I intend to report on the latest round of the Assange extradition case, which will be the U.S. going before the High Court of Justice to appeal on the grounds in which they were granted. To recap, the U.S. government is cleared to essentially challenge that the district court judge, Vanessa Baretzer, did not do the proper criteria, did not use the proper criteria when deciding that Julian Assange would be at risk of suicide or self-harm if he was sent to a U.S. prison or jail, and that there are assurances that the judge should have considered, or that the judge should have asked for assurances from the U.S. government, raised this with them, said, I have these concerns about what may happen to Julian Assange if he's transferred to the United States. How will you protect his human rights? That's their argument. I'm not here to say that there's any validity to what they are arguing. We'll approach that separately when we have the appeal hearing. I'll dig into some of their arguments, but essentially they get to challenge these things that the judge accepted about U.S. prisons, and go before the High Court of Justice and say, as a matter of law, that they believe that the judge did not do this, did not handle this appropriately when denying the extradition request. They don't get to challenge that Julian Assange is a risk of suicide, or they don't get to question the mental health diagnosis that was applied to him by his doctors. And there's a lot that they do not get to contest that I think is going to protect Julian Assange from having the lower court decision overturned. Now that doesn't mean that there's no chance at all for the extradition request to be revived, so to speak. But that being said, I think that Julian Assange is in a pretty good position here. And obviously, it's a much, much better position than if he had lost at the district court level. So I will be there. I'll be covering this case next week somehow, some way. The Dissenter will have a report from the scene. So I just leave it at that for right now. And if you want to become a subscriber, you can go to the dissenter.org to become a free subscriber, but we would really like it if you're able to be a paid subscriber. And we'd like it so much that there's a couple of promotions currently, and we will share those links. You can find those links if you go to the Shadowproof Twitter account. They were shared, but I'll also post those links with this video so that you can know that there's a 25% off promotion if you become a monthly subscriber, and then there's also a 30% off promotion if you become an annual subscriber. And this is just part of our celebration of our 6th birthday, and something we can do to push more of our journalism on whistleblowers, which complements the work we do on prisons and policing and other issues like labor.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I guess on my end, the only updates I have are that we have a couple more Marvel Cook pieces in the works, hopefully publishing 2 next week. Knock on wood. We also have 2 more by some incarcerated contributors out west that I am very excited to share with you. Those obviously taking a little bit more time because we have to do it all by mail, by hand. So we're kind of editing like they used to, I guess, in the days before the internet. But in any case, thanks everybody for joining us. Please follow us wherever you're watching to make sure that you catch us next time. Like Kevin said, definitely subscribe and check out the newsletter linked right here below. If you want other options to give, you can also head on over to shadowproof.com/donate, see what we have. And other than that, be good, and we will see you next week. Take care.